Hey everybody, we're at the Open Source Summit in Denver, and we're going to have a little chat about PyTorch with Matt White, who's the Executive Director for the PyTorch Foundation. Matt, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Hey, very well, thank you.
PyTorch, the foundation, is expanding its mission apparently, and that was some of the conversations that were in the keynote today. So beyond PyTorch itself, what are your ambitions for the foundation?
Sure, yeah. So the foundation's actually grown quite considerably since it started in 2022 with the Linux Foundation. So prior to that, it was with Meta. And so in these last few years, and in particularly in the last about 6 months, we've grown to become an umbrella foundation, which means that we're able to take on additional projects beyond just the PyTorch framework. And this puts us in a really good position to help be good stewards of open source AI and sort of advance the cause and provide tooling in open source that embraces open principles and moves the dial for us. And so some of these projects satisfy really important parts of the AI lifecycle. And so the ecosystem has grown. And we recently announced that we added additional projects, vLLM and DeepSpeed. And we have a few projects on the back burner that we'll be joining shortly as well.
So how far does that go across the life cycle? Because there are open source AI coding tools. I mean, how ambitious can this whole program get?
Sure. So our objective really is to equip AI researchers and engineers and basically scientists and anyone else, even hobbyists, with the tools that they need to be able to do either research or productionalize workloads, or even just learn about PyTorch and learn about AI and deep learning. And so as far as we're going on the horizontal is really from data ingestion, so data pre-processing and storage all the way through for model training, and then right to the tail side of that, which is like inference and serving. And so that really gets us through this like horizontal, where we're also building up vertically, including like AI frameworks, agentic frameworks, and all of the tools that are needed by mainly enterprise to build applications on top of AI models as well.
So does PyTorch, the foundation, become the primary vehicle for open source AI development, or will there be other foundations alongside it that need to kind of collaborate, and what will be the relationship?
Yeah, so I think even within the like specter of like Linux Foundation itself, there are other adjacent projects and adjacent foundations that we have collaborations with. And if you look at like the tech stack for let's just say like serving side for AI, so serving models to end users, on the very bottom of that you have the Linux operating system and the kernel, and built on that you have Kubernetes, and you kind of keep going up. And so there's always going to be this like interplay of different foundations working together. And so we do collaborate with other foundations on AI directed initiatives as well.
When all of this first started out, there was no shortage of tools, and it was kind of, to a lot of folks, it kind of looked like gobbledygook, right? There was all kinds of different things to do, all kinds of different things. Is that starting to coalesce a little bit? Are there certain tools that are maybe becoming de facto standards that are kind of more widely adopted? And have we reached some level of maturity there?
I think the industry has sort of spoke, at least on the like training side with PyTorch, which Hugging Face's announcement that they're going to be strictly based with PyTorch, and they've decommissioned JAX and TensorFlow from their platform. So, and most contemporary models are built on PyTorch. Most distributions of open models are in PyTorch ready format. And so I think at least from the training side and model redistribution side, PyTorch has been sort of the de facto framework of choice. On the serving side, there's still some discussions, but vLLM has kind of skyrocketed up in popularity, and they joined us earlier this year as our initial umbrella foundation project.
No. And vLLM is an open source alternative to CUDA and whatnot, and those types of frameworks, because I don't think everybody knows what vLLM is.
Yeah, sure. So vLLM takes care of like loading a model and serving it, and doing all the inference. So when you go on ChatGPT, you query a model, that on the back end of that, it's serving. And so that's what vLLM solves, right? Is being able to serve up tokens or serve up bits or whatever the case may be, whatever modality it is. And so it's, Torch Serve was a project that in the PyTorch ecosystem that did serving. There's others out there like SG-Lang. And so, but the industry's really rallied around vLLM, and a lot of folks like IBM, Red Hat, Meta, Cisco, others have kind of put their weight behind this serving framework.
And the idea is not to get locked in on the inference side to a particular platform.
Right, yeah.
And is that going to apply not just to GPUs, but other classes of processors? It's kind of, how open is open?
Yeah, so like vLLM team, just like the PyTorch team and others that are working closer to the metal, work with those vendors, right? And so work with AMD, NVIDIA, work with Intel, Qualcomm, ARM, so forth, to make sure that models are performant on their particular silicon, right? And so this is always like a constant process of evaluating, and as PyTorch evolves, as some of these other platforms that work more closely with the silicon evolve, they work sort of hand in hand to make sure that models are performant on these different systems.
Coming back to PyTorch, it's it has a relationship with Python, which is widely adopted by folks beyond just developers. So will we get to the point where we'll see more so-called citizen developers working with PyTorch to go build and train models? How expansive can the target audience get?
Yeah, I think there's some limitations with like especially large models, right? Like when we're talking about smaller models, like for recommender systems or these classifiers that they often use for, identifying whether content is, like for guardrails, like identifying whether content is, has, foul words in it or something like this, right? And so these are a little more accessible because there's a smaller sort of like hardware burden to being able to train those models. But when we talk about large language models, there's significant hardware involved. And so I think where we're sort of seeing the most like usage is actually on the fine tuning side. So someone builds a foundation model, large organization or lab builds that foundation model, releases it with a permissive license, and then downstream users take that model and fine tune it on data for their particular application and create sort of like something that's very tailored to them. Or they experiment with it, and there's a lot of hobbyists out there that can actually never really need to touch PyTorch because they have all these like web accessible tools, right? Like Hugging Face, for example, right? And there's some Unsloth and some other platforms that really make fine tuning and other quantization and these other sort of transformations with models much more accessible. And so I think going back to like, PyTorch, it requires a certain set of skills, to your point on Python, but also having access to the infrastructure needed to be able to train at scale.
There's been a lot of debate about what open source means in the context of AI, and some people are saying that their models are open, and other people say, well, they're not as open as they should be because they don't have like the weights are not included, or I didn't understand how the data was set up. How should we be thinking about open source in the age of AI?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's there's different folks that have different beliefs about what this, when they take like the open source paradigm and apply it into the world of AI, where there's, in the conventional space in open source, we have software, period, right? Now we have all these other artifacts that go into the mix of creating a model and creating some output that can be used by downstream users, right? And so there's training code, there's inference codes, there's different types of data sets that are used for pre-training or fine-tuning and so forth. And then obviously documentation, research papers, there's a lot of things that can go into that. And when the Linux Foundation published something, it's called the Model Openness Framework about a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, which set forth to kind of look at what the definition of open science would be, what would be an open model in this new paradigm, right? And when we're talking about openness. And so we sort of went through these two dimensions of like openness and completeness, where the industry had sort of settled on this term openness to kind of cover the licensing, cover how many components are released. we went and looked at, okay, completeness is really like how many components are released. And then openness is it released under an open source or open license, right? And so we try to disentangle that to make it much more clear to the public, like what each is responsible for. And I think conflating those two things makes it very difficult to understand like what open source AI really is and what open models are. But if, within our classification system, an open model to us was, a model and its associated weights, but released under a permissive license, right? And this is what gives you, what sort of embraces that spirit of openness, because in open source, it's about being able to use, modify, study for any purpose without limitations. And so we were able to replicate that with models through that framework.
Most of the usage of models, at least the ones we hear about anyway, seem to be tied up around proprietary ones. Is the open source models going to become more dominant as we go along? Because history would show us that open source seems to eventually catch up, and then it becomes the innovation engine when everybody starts contributing.
Yeah. And we see this time and time again, right? Where things are sort of released as black boxes or developed in-house, and then their open source community replicates them. And then when the sort of performance differential is so minute, eventually like folks really rally around the open solutions, and then the innovation happens on top, right? And so with models, we're seeing that there were big leaps, and open source is way behind black box solutions for models. And then we sort of saw that gap close. And now we're at the point where a lot less companies are releasing these foundation models because the differential isn't so extreme between the last generation and this generation. And I think we'll start to see less innovation potentially on the model side, although it's not going away. But a lot more interest in innovation on the system side, which is now where we're seeing like people that are looking at like, how do I integrate with this back office system? How do I get data out of this particular database? And we're seeing the rise of protocols and standards like MCP and A to A and others to try and solve a lot of these problems. But now that we're more systems focused, we're going to see a lot more innovation in that space, and continue to grow around innovating on top of these foundation models that may not, they'll continue to incrementally get better, but the industry may not be as model focused as they are systems focused when we try to operationalize these platforms.
Yeah. Last question.
Sure.
And I hear this all the time. Everybody kind of, they hear open source and they nod their head and they have a warm feeling for it, but they don't know where to get started. They don't know how to join the community, and they don't seem to have a good handle on where do I get involved. So if you want folks to, come work with you on the PyTorch Foundation, where should they get started? Where's the interface?
Sure. Yeah. I think there's a few entry points, right? So like in terms of discussions, we have this discuss.pytorch.org, which is our discussion boards, where people can glean a lot of information from that. We're also actually building out, we do currently have like tutorials and other artifacts online, but we actually have 2 programs the foundation is launching this summer, which are focused on training and certification. And the other is with what we call like academic outreach or OSPO outreach. So we're building the packets so that educators can teach their students how to get started with PyTorch, how to get off the ground with it. And then on the training side, we're actually building training materials and certifications for both entry level and advanced, PyTorch skills. And then we also have like our Discord server and Slack, which are good forums for people to kind of get involved and start asking some of the questions about like, how do I get started? And how can I train a model and experiment and these sort of things.
All right, folks, you heard it here. There's a new epicenter starting to emerge around open source AI, and it's at the PyTorch Foundation, so check it out. Matt, thanks for coming by.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah.
And we'll be back in a minute.